Now we're joined by Professor Astrid Kappers from Technical University of Eindhoven. Astrid is a researcher who's been exploring haptics, and particularly haptic and visual perception for a long time, and she'll be talking today about haptic perception and haptic devices for communication. At least you will when we've managed to get the clicker up and running. Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Astrid.
Thank you, Ray. And thank you, Nasreen, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here to present my work and also to meet many of you, because since COVID, it has been a long time since I met several of the people I knew, and also it's very nice to meet new people. Yes, so I'm based in Eindhoven, in the Netherlands, at the Eindhoven University of Technology. And indeed, my focus of research is haptic perception and haptic devices for communication. And Nasreen asked me to focus especially on haptic perception because, yeah, that's an interesting field. So, oh, it already worked. Yeah, so my research focuses on exploring ideas for how you could convey information by other means than visual or auditory information. And well, of course, that brings you quite soon to touch. And then you can distinguish a number of different modalities within the touch, like pressure or squeezing, thermal stimulation, although thermal is strictly speaking not really touch, but we always take it together, and vibration. So I will talk a bit about that. Now, the main messages that I want to give you today are that touch perception is not veridical. And maybe veridical is not a word that all of you know, but it means that it's not always correct. So it's not that if you touch something, it's the real life that you feel. You can make mistakes. There are lots of illusions, and I will show a number of them. Then, well, we did some research into thermal stimulation, and well, it's almost trivial, but it's slow because the heat has to conduct from one place to another, and it's technically challenging because if you present heat, you also have to remove the heat, so you really need ways to do that. And another main message is that vibration, if you use that in a device, that's really of potential interest. What I also find an important message is that when you design an haptic device, you really need to look into the fundamental knowledge that is known already. And lots of this knowledge is not available. So that's where my research comes in, because not everything is in handbooks already. But I think it's very important because, for example, you can create something with a very high resolution, but if the skin doesn't need that resolution, it's a waste of money. Sometimes there are illusions, you can make use of them. So to create an effect that's very useful in this device, but then you really need to know about these. So I will present some of the research, not all done by me, but also from the literature. So to start with a few examples of thermal perception, what you see here are three, well, let's call it buttons of different temperatures, but you could also try it yourself, and I really think you should do that by using coins and put them in a heater or in an oven for some time and make sure they are warm. And so there are three here, and the middle one has a neutral temperature, and the two outer ones are warm. Put your fingers on it, so 3 fingers, and what you will experience is that they all 3 feel equally warm. So that's how your thermal perception works. It's not that you feel 2 warm ones and the middle neutral, but you feel 3 equally warm ones. The same happens if you do that with cold ones. So put the coins in the freezer for a time and you can do the experiment yourself. Put your hand on it and they all 3 feel equally cold. Now what if you make the 3 warm already from the start? You can do that easily, put your fingers on it, and then the middle one feels warmer than that. So, and also for the cold one. Yeah. So if you do this experiment yourself, you should be very quick because temperatures change all the time. But it's possible. And this was already published in 77, last century. And this effect is called thermal referral. So it's a known effect. But if you work with temperature, you need to know that. Another interesting effect is if you have a number of bars that are cold, 20 degrees. So you can put your hand on it and it feels cold. Simple. You can also have some bars with a somewhat warmer temperature, 40 degrees. It's not burning or so, so you can put your hand on it. And indeed, if you put your hand on it, it feels warm. Now, what happens if you interlace these bars? So you create a grid like this. So you have the cold ones, again, 20 degrees, the warm ones, 40 degrees. On average, if you would measure it physically, it would be a temperature of 30 degrees, which is almost, yeah, hand temperature. However, if you put your hand on it, it feels like as if you're touching a grill. So that's why it's called a thermal grill illusion. So it gives a burning sensation. And well, I'm not going into any explanation now, but it has to do with conflicting information that you get into your system. So somehow your brain cannot deal with this. So that's another example. So to summarize, the thermal perception, well, I did not say anything about this, but it's important to know the resolution is poor and it's usually slow, at least if you want to convey information. It's not veridical. Well, I gave you now some examples. It's technically challenging because, yeah, you also have to cool again if you so you need a heat sink and they need to be big, and so it's really somewhat problematic. But there are also in the literature some examples of people, yeah, trying to do some research or create some devices. And I will show one example just from the literature where people try. So what they created is kind of an armband, and in this experiment, they used it for families with children. Children are somewhere else, and you could press a button and then you could give a warm or a cold signal to the other person. So to show either I think of you or I'm not feeling very happy. And well, they enjoyed this. So it's a prototype of something. I'm not sure whether it's useful, but yeah. These are the kinds of experiments that are published in, well, relatively recently. Okay, now I go to tactile acuity. This is something that's known already since even a century earlier. Is that if you have 2 pressure points on the back, for example, you have them at a horizontal distance, then to make them equally distinguishable, you need a larger vertical distance than a horizontal distance. And that's not only true for the back, but you find it in many places. So also along the arm, the sensitivity across the arm is higher than along the arm. It's also true for the fingers or on the leg. So this is something that you find in many body parts. This is what you see here is some vibrations, first 2 times at one location and then a third one at another location. You can do it with 2 locations, but you can also do it with more. This is not how it feels. How it feels is something more like this. So the second one is perceived somewhere in between the first and the third one. And you can also do that. They did many experiments with different timings, different numbers of vibrations, different locations. And if you have more than 3, it really feels like a rabbit hopping over your arm. So that's why they call it the cutaneous rabbit illusion. This is another example. If you have a vibration, a strong vibration at a certain point, and it's followed by, it doesn't follow anymore. Let's go back. Let's see whether it works. That's a pity. Okay, but I can explain. So if you have a strong vibration followed by a weak vibration at the same location, it feels as if it's moving downwards. So it doesn't feel as if it's in the same location. If you test it on the back, it feels as if it's going down. And you can also do the opposite. So here you first have a weak stimulation followed by a strong one, and that feels as if something is moving upwards. So if you are designing a device for the back for communication, these are the things you have to take into account, because otherwise it could lead to misperceptions. Now, this is a vest that is made here in Boras during the suitcase project, and we did some experiments with that, and these are nice squares. It's a nice kind of weaving, and we could put vibration motors in different locations, so we did some experiments with that. And well, I give you some examples of things we found out. So one thing is that if you ask participants, you give them 2 vibrations, and you ask them to estimate the distance, and they could use arbitrary units. So they did not have to say it's 5 centimeters. They could just give a number. The only thing was that if something felt twice as big, they had to use twice as big number. That's a common method in psychology that works. What we found is that if you cross the spine, so if you give 2 stimulations on different sides of the spine, it feels much bigger than if you give the same distance at one side of the spine. So if you want to make something clear, use the spine or different sides of the spine. What is also very clear is that if you do it simultaneously, so in the first example here, it was sequential stimulation and they had to estimate the distance. But if you give them 2 vibrations in different locations, but at the same time, then you feel something in the middle. So if you have to estimate distance here, it feels like, yeah, 0 or something. So you could use that, of course, if you want something to be present in the middle, and but you do not have a vibrator at that location, so you could use 2 other vibrations to feel it in the middle. So that's something you could use when designing a device using vibrations. So to summarize this part of the talk, spatial resolution, I did not really show that. It varies strongly from place to place, but that's maybe something you are aware of. If you look at the resolution of your finger, it's much higher than on your back. So a famous or a usual test is the 2-point discrimination test. So if you put 2 small picks on your finger and you have to say, is it 1 or 2, then for experience it too, you can have a few millimeters on your fingertip, but it can be like 10 centimeters on your back. And we do this always with students, and they are really surprised because, yeah, a distance like this, you really do not feel on your back. You need a larger distance. Well, distances are not always perceived as equal. That's the horizontal vertical anisotropy that I showed you. And intensity influences direction perception. And then, well, the good thing is vibrations are easily felt, you can easily present them, and they are potentially useful to use in, yeah, as a means of conveying information. So I have some, or based on literature research and our own research, we came to a number of design recommendations if you want to create something for the back. And that was one of the topics we were working on in Suitcase, but I know that yeah, several people are working on that. So one thing is that it's better to exclude the spine. So what we notice is that people do not like a vibration motor directly on the spine because there's bone conduction and it gives a weird feeling. So try to avoid that. And also the spine is different from, yeah, other locations. So sometimes yeah, you really have mislocations because it's close to the spine. It works as an anchor point. Then, well, if you want something to feel square at some point, you have to take into account that this resolution is different for horizontal and vertical direction. So what we usually do is have the spacing in the vertical direction somewhat larger than in the horizontal direction. If you want to convey some important information, use different parts of the spine, so left and right, because it's more distinctive. If you want to, now for example, sometimes you want to convey a shape like a square. Well, it doesn't work if you present it all together. It simply doesn't work because this will feel as a very strong vibration somewhere in the middle or distributed over a large part of the back, but it certainly will not feel like a square. If you want to present a shape, then you have to do it sequentially, and then it is possible to, yeah, to create a square. And yeah, based on all these previous recommendations, we think that if you want to use something for the back, then 4x4 grid of vibration motors is probably yeah, good. Your back is of course longer, so you could have more in the vertical direction, but you don't want to use the spine, so you need an even number. And well, the spacing, yeah, needs to be quite substantial. And also what I told earlier, if you want to present something in between, you can use two vibration motors at the same time, because then it feels in the middle. So you also already with a 4x4 grid, you can present many different yeah, patterns. Now I want to mention three types of devices, two of which we have worked and one from the literature. So this is research we did in Suitcase, and yeah, at that point we still worked with a 3x3 grid, so that was before our own recommendations, but you have to learn at some point. If you so the social haptic communication, I hope that most of you are familiar with that. you can create patterns on the back for extra environmental information. And this is an example that across means alarm. And we tried that, whether you can feel that, and it works quite good. And we also tested that with a number of people with deaf blindness, and also people who are teaching this social haptic communication, and they gave us very useful feedback on all these things. For example, with the timing of or the strength of the stimulation. So I could tell you much more about that, but I have no time for that. But what we found is that many of the we tested several of these standard patterns, and many of these patterns were recognized by these users right away. So they are familiar with social haptic communication, and they could recognize many of these symbols simulated with this vibration. And they also thought, well, it would be easy to learn. So also the ones that they could not understand right away, they said, okay, but if I try it a number of times, I will be able to learn that. And well, we also got feedback that they wanted to adjust the speed and the strength. Then what we also did is a small experiment with learning vibrotactile Morse code, because we think that that would be useful for short messages. And we did a simple experiment just with students without any impairments. We presented the dots to one arm and the dashes to the other. A dash is a somewhat longer duration of a vibration in our case. And we learned from the literature that it was better to present it to two arms, because that's easier to learn. We had 30 minutes of learning letters and 20 minutes of word testing. And well, all our participants, we had 10 participants, they learned at least 15 letters in these 30 minutes. And well, the words consisting of just 2 letters were recognized for 75%, and 8% correct if it was longer. But this was only a very short time, and we are currently running a more extensive experiment with repeated meetings 1 week between, just to see what the retention is. And our overall conclusions from this experiment was that it's well, it seems promising, because performance with hardly any training was already, somewhat successful, and we think it might be suitable for short messages. Then one final thing I want to mention, that's not our own research, but I think this is the most advanced communication device that exists currently. It's a group in the US by Reed et al. And Tan et al. At 2 different universities, but also connected to Facebook and Disney. So what they have is a sleeve with 24 vibrators, and they created different patterns for different phonemes. And so you put it on your arm. It's quite bulky, and also there's a computer connected to it, so it's not wearable in that sense that you could walk around with it. And but I did many experiments with it, and they found for phonemes 60% correct identification after 4 hours. I tried it on at a conference, and indeed I could, within a few minutes, I could learn a number of phonemes, because they also tried that, for example, an O, there's something round, that it's also something round your arm, and a plosive, that's something. So they try to make the phonemes, and the vibration pattern somewhat similar. And well, they also did very extensive experiments, but there was also words identification after 4 to 8 hours. And in Eindhoven, that's the last thing I want to mention, is that there's a group of very enthusiastic students that came up themselves to create a sleeve also for communication, but in their case it's wearable and they can walk around with it. And these students do not do that for study points, but only because they are very interested in this topic. And it has been going on for a number of years, and every time they try to find new students, follow up. So in September, some new students started and some old students are still there. And it's really nice group of students to work with. So the conclusions from this research was that there's reasonable success after relatively short training time. And I think at this moment, this is the most promising device based on phonemes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Astrid.